Luminara Prime looked like someone had given a city planner unlimited budget, psychedelic drugs, and a firm conviction that the color spectrum ended at aggressively neon. Doctor. Elias Marsh stood on the balcony of his embassy quarters, watching buildings shift through colors that didn't have names in any human language, and wondered, not for the first time, if his doctoral thesis on interspecies cultural integration was really worth the persistent sensory overload. The city floated on anti-gravity platforms that hummed with energy, creating a three-dimensional urban landscape where up and down were suggestions rather than rules. Skybridges connected towers at impossible angles, gardens grew sideways on vertical surfaces, and the whole thing was illuminated by bioluminescent technology that made the night sky look like a rave had achieved sentience. His communicator chimed with a message from the Interstellar Anthropological Institute. Monthly report overdue. Please submit cultural observations and integration progress metrics. Elias stared at it, contemplated the academic language required to describe "everything is weird and my brain hurts," and decided caffeine was necessary before tackling bureaucratic documentation. The embassy's common area was mercifully decorated in human aesthetic, right angles, muted colors, furniture that didn't change shape based on collective emotional resonance. Elias poured coffee that tasted like homesickness and resignation, then settled at a table to review his notes from yesterday's cultural exhibition. "You look like a man contemplating career choices," a voice said behind him, human, female, carrying the particular exhaustion that came from long-term alien immersion. Dr. Sarah Chin dropped into the opposite chair, her own coffee mug reading, "I survived first contact, and all I got was this lousy culture shock." She was a xenobiologist, 3 years into her posting, and had the resigned expression of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything. "Just reviewing notes," Elias said, trying to make watching aliens glow at each other for 3 hours sound academically rigorous. "Good luck with that. I spent yesterday explaining to the Institute that yes, luminary reproduction really does involve synchronized light shows and harmonic resonance. And no, I cannot demonstrate this in a laboratory setting, because it's considered profoundly intimate, and also I'm not equipped for that kind of participant observation." Elias laughed despite himself. 6 months on Luminara Prime, and he'd learned that xenoanthropology was mostly awkward questions and cultural misunderstandings, with occasional moments of profound insight buried under layers of confusion. "How's your work with Princess Kavira?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting the question wasn't entirely professional. "Fine, professional. She's been very helpful with cultural contextualization." "And how many times did you use 'fascinating' in yesterday's research notes?" "That's standard observational language." 16 times, according to the shared database, specifically referring to her explanation of bioluminescent communication patterns. Sarah grinned. "You're not subtle, Marsh." Elias felt heat creep up his neck. "It's academic interest. Keep telling yourself that. Just maybe don't put it in your official reports. The Institute frowns on researchers developing personal attachments to their subjects of study." She left him with his coffee and his dignity in pieces, and Elias returned to his quarters to work on reports that would carefully avoid mentioning how many times he'd noticed the specific patterns in Princess Kavira's bioluminescence, or the way her laugh had a musical quality that human vocal cords couldn't replicate. Instead, he opened his private journal, actual paper, because some habits from Earth persisted even on planets where books were considered charmingly primitive. The journal was his space to be honest, to write observations that would never appear in official documentation, to process the overwhelming nature of living somewhere that made his nervous system question reality on a daily basis. Today's entry started clinical. Notes on yesterday's exhibition, observations about luminary social customs, analysis of how bioluminescent communication created social bonds that humans could barely perceive. But somewhere around page 3, his handwriting got messier and his observations more personal. Princess Kavira explained the bonding ceremony today. The way she described the emotional synchronization, the pride in her voice when discussing her culture's traditions, there was something captivating about it. Her bioluminescence pulsed in patterns I've started to recognize. Deep blue with gold undertones means passionate engagement with subject matter. The spiral formation around her temples indicates she's enjoying the teaching process. I've memorized these patterns without meaning to, can read her emotional state better than I can read most humans. This is probably inappropriate for objective research, but observation requires attention to detail, and I'm nothing if not detailed in my observations. He continued writing, documenting things that felt significant. The way she'd paused mid-explanation to make sure he understood a complex concept, how she'd laughed when he mispronounced a ceremonial term, the moment their eyes met and held for a beat longer than professionally necessary. It was self-indulgent and probably unprofessional, but the journal was private, his own space to admit things he'd never say aloud. A message appeared on his data pad. Princess Kavira requesting his presence at tomorrow's diplomatic function. Formal attire required. Topic: Introduction to traditional Luminari artistic expression. Elias added this to his calendar, then returned to his journal with observations that definitely wouldn't appear in his official reports, thoughts about the complexity of cross-species attraction, about the particular challenge of maintaining professional boundaries when the subject of your research was someone you found increasingly difficult to observe objectively, about the way certain luminary features that should have registered as alien instead registered as beautiful in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He closed the journal, tucked it carefully into his desk drawer with his other private documentation, and tried to convince himself that writing detailed observations about Princess Kavira's bioluminescent patterns was totally normal researcher behavior, and definitely not a sign that he was developing feelings that were probably inappropriate given their professional relationship, and the minor detail that they were different species. Outside his window, Luminara Prime continued its neon symphony, buildings shifting colors in response to the city's collective emotional resonance. Somewhere in the Palace District, Princess Kavira was presumably going about her diplomatic duties, completely unaware that a human researcher was filling journals with observations that crossed the line from academic to personal with increasing frequency. Elias told himself this was fine. Private journals stayed private. Professional boundaries would remain intact. His feelings were his own business, carefully documented but never acknowledged, admired from a safe distance where they couldn't create complications. It was a good plan right up until it stopped working, which, spoiler alert, would happen sooner than he expected. The floating gardens existed in defiance of several laws of physics and at least one principle of sensible urban planning. Elias stood on the entrance platform, watching massive biodomes drift through the air above Luminara Prime's central district, each one cultivating ecosystems from different regions of the Luminari Empire. Plants that shouldn't exist in the same atmosphere grew in carefully maintained biomes, connected by transparent walkways that made Elias' fear of heights suggest maybe he should have pursued a less vertigo-inducing field of study. Princess Kavira met him at the entrance, wearing formal diplomatic attire that was somehow both modest and distracting. Layered silk that shifted through shades of blue and silver, bioluminescent patterns incorporated into the fabric that pulsed in gentle rhythms. Her long ears were adorned with jewelry that caught the light, and her expression showed the patient amusement that appeared whenever Elias looked overwhelmed by luminary culture. Dr. Marsh, thank you for agreeing to observe the bonding ceremony. It's an honor we don't extend to many off-world researchers. Thank you for the invitation, Your Highness. I'll do my best to represent the experience accurately. Elias clutched his data pad like a shield against the sheer alien beauty of everything around him. Please, when we're working together, Kavira is acceptable. She gestured toward the nearest floating garden. The ceremony will take place in the Harmonic Pavilion. Try not to fall off any walkways. The diplomatic incident paperwork is extensive. They crossed transparent bridges that shouldn't have supported weight, but did, passing through biomes that ranged from crystalline forests to gardens, where plants communicated through bioluminescent pulses. Elias took notes with one part of his brain, while the other part tried to process the casual way Kavira had suggested he use her personal name, as if that wasn't a shift in their professional dynamic that made his heart rate spike. The Harmonic Pavilion was exactly what it sounded like, a circular platform suspended in the air, surrounded by plants that responded to emotional resonance with light and sound. A small crowd of luminari had gathered, their bioluminescence creating a constantly shifting light show as they communicated in their visual language. Kavira guided Elias to an observation area, explaining the ceremony's elements in a voice that carried both cultural pride and genuine affection for her traditions. Two luminari, the bonding couple, stood in the pavilion's center, their bioluminescent patterns beginning to synchronize as they performed ritualized movements. "Watch their markings," Kavira said softly, standing close enough that Elias could see the patterns on her own skin shifting in response to the ceremony. When luminari bond, their bioluminescence synchronizes. It's not voluntary, it's a biological response to deep emotional connection. They're literally becoming attuned to each other's emotional state. The ceremony was beautiful in ways that made Elias forget to take notes. The couple moved in perfect synchronization, their bioluminescence pulsing in identical patterns, creating harmonics that made the surrounding plants glow brighter. The crowd's patterns shifted to match, a collective celebration of connection, of two individuals choosing to sync their emotional frequencies. Elias watched, documented, and tried to ignore the way Kavira's proximity made his own emotional frequency do things that definitely weren't synchronization, but felt significant anyway. After the ceremony, as they walked back through the floating gardens, Kavira asked about human bonding practices with genuine curiosity. Elias explained marriage, dating rituals, the way humans used words and promises instead of bioluminescent synchronization. She listened with the focused attention that made him feel like his observations mattered, asking clarifying questions that showed she was actually engaged rather than just being polite. "Humans hide so much," she said eventually. "Your bonding happens through verbal commitments, but your true feelings remain internal. How do you know if connection is genuine when both parties can conceal their emotional truth? We don't always, we trust. We watch for consistency between words and actions over time. It's messier than your way, but it's what we have." Messy but honest in its own way. Her bioluminescence shifted to patterns that looked thoughtful. Perhaps there's beauty in the uncertainty, in choosing to trust despite the inability to see truth directly. That evening, alone in his quarters, Elias opened his journal and wrote pages about the ceremony, the technical elements, the cultural significance, the way luminary biology created emotional bonds that humans could only approximate through language and time. But buried in the academic observations were more personal admissions. Watching Kavira explain the ceremony with such passion made something in his chest feel tight. Her bioluminescent patterns during the explanation were the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The way she'd stood close enough that he could have counted the individual markings on her skin if he'd been less concerned with maintaining professional boundaries. He wrote about the moment their shoulders had accidentally touched on the walkway, how her bioluminescence had flickered in response. A pattern he didn't know how to read, but that felt significant. He documented the way she laughed when he'd asked if luminari ever bonded with other species. Her answer that emotional compatibility mattered more than biological similarity. The careful way she'd looked at him when saying it as if checking his reaction. It was self-indulgent writing, observations that crossed from research into something more intimate. But the journal was private, his space to process feelings that had nowhere else to go, to admit that somewhere between documenting cultural practices and learning to read bioluminescent emotional states, he developed feelings for his research subject that were probably inappropriate and definitely complicated. Weeks passed in a pattern of professional interactions that felt increasingly personal. Kavira sought him out for conversations beyond required research sessions, shared stories about her childhood in the palace, asked questions about Earth with the kind of curiosity that suggested genuine interest rather than diplomatic obligation. They developed inside jokes about the absurdities of protocol, bonded over shared frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency, found unexpected common ground between their vastly different backgrounds. Elia's journal filled with observations that would never appear in official reports. The way Kavira tilted her head when considering difficult concepts, how her bioluminescence showed specific patterns when she was amused versus when she was genuinely delighted, the musical quality of her laugh that he described in embarrassing detail. He documented the small touches that were probably just friendly gestures but felt significant, her hand on his arm when making a point, the way she stood close enough that he could see the individual colors in her markings, moments when their eyes met and held for beats longer than professionally necessary. He told himself he was just being observant, that good research required attention to detail, that his feelings were carefully contained within the private journal where they couldn't create complications. He was wrong, but he wouldn't realize that until much later, when private observations became public knowledge and professional distance collapsed into something far more complicated. The diplomatic reception was being held in the Grand Pavilion, which meant Elias had to wear formal attire that made him feel like he was playing dress-up in someone else's cultural traditions. Human formal wear, a tailored suit that had cost a month's stipend, looked aggressively plain next to luminary formal wear that literally glowed and shifted colors based on the wearer's emotional state. The pavilion itself was a masterwork of luminary architecture, a massive dome that shifted through colors in response to the crowd's collective mood, floors that seemed to float without visible support, and lighting that came from bioluminescent installations rather than artificial sources. Diplomats from multiple species mingled with varying degrees of success, creating a visual chaos of different heights, colors, and social customs colliding in expensive clothing. Elias was making small talk with other human researchers, the kind of conversation that involved nodding at appropriate intervals, while his brain categorized luminary social interactions for his notes, when the room's lighting shifted dramatically. The collective bioluminescence of the luminary guests pulsed in synchronized patterns, and Elias turned to see Princess Kavira entering the pavilion in full ceremonial regalia. His brain short-circuited. She wore traditional royal attire that made her previous formal clothing look casual by comparison. Layered silk that shifted through shades of blue, silver, and deep purple, bioluminescent patterns woven direct. Later, alone in his quarters with the reception sensory overload fading into memory, Elias opened his journal and wrote, not academic observations, not cultural documentation, just raw, unfiltered honesty about the way Kavira had looked in ceremonial attire, the patterns in her bioluminescence that seemed brighter than usual, the moment their eyes met and she'd smiled at him specifically. He described the ceremonial clothing in detail that would be embarrassing if anyone read it, the way the fabric moved with her, how the bioluminescent patterns highlighted features he'd been trying not to notice, the crystalline crown that caught light and threw it back in colors that humans didn't have names for. He wrote about the complications of finding someone beautiful when they were a different species, a princess, and technically his research subject, about the particular torture of maintaining professional distance while wanting to close it, about the way his heart had stopped when she smiled at him, and the immediate self-recrimination that followed because He was supposed to be objective and professional, and definitely not developing feelings that were inappropriate on multiple levels. It was self-indulgent and potentially problematic, but the journal was private, his space to process emotions that had nowhere else to go, to admit things he'd never say aloud, to document feelings that were real even if they were complicated. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling pages with observations that crossed every boundary between professional and personal, then closed the journal and tucked it carefully into his desk drawer with the rest of his private documentation. The next morning arrived with artificial cheerfulness. Luminara Prime's lighting systems, simulating sunrise in colors that suggested morning, should be more enthusiastic about existing. Elia's communicator chimed with an unexpected message. Princess Kavira requesting his presence in her private study. Topic: Research collaboration opportunity. He arrived at the Palace District, an area of the city where architecture became even more impossible and security protocols even more stringent, and was escorted through corridors that shifted colors as he passed. The guard's bioluminescence showed patterns he'd learned meant visitor being evaluated for threat level, which was reassuring in its consistency, if not its friendliness. Kavira's private study overlooked the central plaza, offering views of the city's perpetual light show through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was decorated with artifacts from luminary history, ancient texts preserved in crystalline cases, ceremonial objects that still glowed with residual bioluminescence, art pieces that seemed to respond to emotional presence. And Kavira, standing by the window with her back to the door, holding something that made Elia's stomach drop through several floors of the floating palace. His journal. His private, personal, embarrassingly detailed journal. She turned as he entered, her bioluminescence showing patterns that looked like amusement mixed with something softer, more complex. Her long ears rotated toward him, tracking his reaction, and her expression suggested she'd read enough to understand exactly what the journal contained. "I read what you wrote about my body, human," she said, her voice carrying that musical quality Elias had described in excessive detail on page 47. "Your observations are thorough." Elias' brain offered several response options: denial, explanation, spontaneous combustion. But his mouth went with stunned silence. His face was burning, his career was presumably over, and the floor was refusing his telepathic requests to open and swallow him. Kavira moved closer, still holding the journal, her bioluminescence shifting through patterns that Elias couldn't read through his panic. She opened to a specific page. He recognized his own handwriting, could see the date from the night after the bonding ceremony, and began reading aloud. Watching Princess Kavira explain the ceremony, the passion in her voice when discussing her culture's traditions, there was something captivating about it. Her bioluminescence pulsed in patterns I've started to recognize. Deep blue with gold undertones means passionate engagement with subject matter. I've memorized these patterns without meaning to, can read her emotional state better than I can read most humans. She paused, looked up at him with eyes that were definitely amused, and continued to a different entry. The way the ceremonial clothing highlighted her form, the bioluminescent patterns creating visual harmony with her natural markings, it was beautiful in ways that transcend cultural context. I find myself thinking about her appearance with frequency that would be concerning if I let myself examine it too closely. Elias wished desperately for any of the several embarrassing ways this conversation could end that didn't involve him having to stand here, while she read his private thoughts aloud in a voice that made those thoughts even more mortifying in retrospect. Kavira closed the journal carefully, set it on her desk, and her bioluminescence shifted to patterns that looked almost vulnerable. "You write beautifully," she said. "Embarrassingly so, but beautifully." The silence after Kavira's words stretched like elastic about to snap. Elias stood frozen in her study, his brain cycling through responses that ranged from coherent apology to incoherent stammering, while she watched him with bioluminescent patterns that definitely meant something important if he could think past his mortification long enough to read them. "How did you?" he started, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "You dropped it after our last research session. Palace staff brought it to me thinking it was official documentation." She gestured to the journal on her desk. I realized what it was after the first few pages, but I kept reading. "I'm sorry for the invasion of privacy, but I'm not sorry for what I learned. I never meant for anyone to read that. It was private processing. Unprofessional observations that I kept separate from official research, specifically because—" Elias ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that made Kavira's bioluminescence flicker with what might have been fondness. "I'm sorry. I should have maintained better boundaries." "Why?" She tilted her head, ears rotating in the gesture that indicated genuine curiosity. "Why should you have hidden observations about connection, about finding beauty in cultural differences, about emotional responses to interaction? What about those things required boundaries? Because you're a princess. Because I'm here as a researcher. Because you're a different species and I'm supposed to be objective," and he gestured helplessly at the journal. "Because those observations are inappropriate for someone in my position." Kavira moved closer, her bioluminescence shifting through patterns that looked vulnerable in ways he'd never seen from her. "Do you know how luminary emotional bonds form?" She didn't wait for his answer. "We read bioluminescence, body language, the subtle frequencies in voice and movement. We can't hide our emotional states. They're literally visible to anyone trained to read them. I know, I've documented. Which means I've known for weeks that your feelings went beyond professional interest." Her eyes met his directly, and her patterns showed something that looked like hope mixed with uncertainty. "I've watched you try to maintain distance while every gesture betrayed deeper emotion. Your attempts at objectivity were admirable and completely transparent to anyone who knew how to look." Elias felt something shift in his chest, mortification giving way to a different kind of panic. "You knew." "I suspected. Your journal confirmed it." She picked up the journal, held it carefully. "But what I didn't know was the depth of your observation, the care with which you tried to understand not just luminary culture but me specifically. The way you see details that others miss, find beauty in things that most humans consider merely alien. That doesn't make it appropriate." "No, but it makes it honest." Her bioluminescence settled into patterns that looked resolute. "Luminary culture values honesty above discretion. We consider hidden emotions more problematic than expressed ones, even when those emotions are complicated. You tried to hide your feelings to maintain professional boundaries, which I understand is human practice. But by luminary standards, your honesty, even private honesty, is more valuable than maintained distance." She set the journal down, moved close enough that Elias could see the individual colors in her markings, the way they pulsed with her emotional state. "I should tell you something. I've been observing you just as carefully as you've observed me. Documenting not in journals but in memory. The way you approach cultural learning with genuine respect. How you find humor in confusion rather than frustration. The kindness in your interactions with everyone regardless of species or status. That's just basic decency." "It's not actually. Many researchers see luminari as subjects to be studied rather than individuals to be understood. You've always treated me as a person first, a princess second, and a research subject distant third." Her patterns shifted to something warmer. "You see me, Elias. Not just my position or my appearance, but me as an individual. That's rare and valuable." Elias' heart was doing complicated things that probably violated several physiological principles. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been just as inappropriately interested as you have. The difference is that luminary philosophy holds that acknowledged connection is preferable to maintained distance, even when that connection is complicated." She paused, her bioluminescence showing patterns that looked vulnerable. The question is whether what you wrote is merely fascination with the exotic, or if you see me, truly see me, as someone worthy of genuine connection beyond cultural curiosity. But it's not fascination. The words came out before Elias could filter them through professional caution. It's, I find you remarkable, the way you navigate diplomacy while maintaining genuine warmth. How you're patient with my constant questions. Your laugh, your intelligence, the way you make me want to understand not just your culture but you specifically. That's not exotic fascination, that's just you. Kavira's bioluminescence exploded into patterns he'd never seen, complex, vibrant, pulsing with what looked like joy mixed with relief. Then we have something to discuss. Honestly, without professional distance as a shield. What followed was the most vulnerable conversation Elias had ever had. They discussed the complications, species differences that made certain forms of intimacy challenging, cultural barriers that would require constant navigation, the power imbalance between a princess and a researcher. Kavira explained that Luminari partnerships were built on emotional compatibility rather than biological similarity, that her culture had precedent for cross-species bonds, that social position mattered less than genuine connection. Elias admitted his fears, that his feelings were one-sided, that he was projecting meaning onto friendly gestures, that the biological gulfs between them made real connection impossible. Kavira countered each concern with observations of her own. She'd sought his company beyond professional obligation, shared personal stories she didn't share with other researchers, responded to his presence with bioluminescent patterns that indicated attraction and affection. "I kept your journal," she said eventually, holding it carefully. Not as evidence of inappropriate behavior, but as documentation of the moment when private observation became acknowledged possibility. "You documented seeing me clearly. I want to remember when I decided to let you." "What happens now?" Elias asked, feeling like he was standing at the edge of something undefined and potentially life-changing. "Now we try. Carefully, with full acknowledgement that we're building something neither of our cultures has fully figured out yet." Her patterns shifted to something that looked like determination mixed with hope. Luminari philosophy holds that honest exploration of connection is always preferable to safe distance. The question is whether you're willing to explore despite the complications. Elias thought about the months of careful observation, of hiding feelings in private journals, of admiring from distance that felt safe but hollow. He thought about Kavira's bioluminescence showing patterns that meant hope, about her willingness to acknowledge feelings he'd thought were one-sided, about the possibility that maybe his detailed observations weren't just research, but the beginning of genuine understanding. "I'm willing," he said, terrified but willing. Kavira smiled, not the diplomatic expression she wore for formal functions, but something genuine and warm and specifically for him. Her bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that Elias had documented extensively in his journal. Deep contentment mixed with anticipation, the specific rhythm that indicated she was emotionally invested in his response. She moved to the window overlooking Luminara Prime's perpetual light show, and Elias joined her. They stood close enough that their shoulders touched, watching the city glow with its characteristic neon brilliance, and neither felt the need to maintain the professional distance that had defined their relationship until now. "Your journal will make an interesting historical document," Kavira said eventually. "The moment a human researcher stopped observing objectively and started seeing subjectively, when cultural study became personal connection." "I'm never living this down, am I?" "Probably not. But think of it as documentation for future researchers studying cross-species relationship formation. Your embarrassingly detailed observations will advance the field." "That's supposed to make me feel better." "No, but this might." She took his hand, the first time they'd touched with clear intention rather than accident, and her bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that meant trust, affection, hope for shared future. "We'll figure this out together. one embarrassingly honest observation at a time. Outside, Luminara Prime continued its neon symphony, buildings shifting colors in response to the city's collective emotional resonance. Inside Kavira's study, two people from different worlds stood together acknowledging connection that defied simple categorization. Not quite research, not quite romance, but something undefined and complicated and entirely their own. Elias looked at their joined hands, at the way Kavira's bioluminescence created patterns that included his touch and her emotional expression, and realized that maybe his journal's observations weren't inappropriate. They were just the beginning of translation. Learning to read not just cultural practices but individual hearts, one carefully documented pattern at a time. I should probably stop writing quite so much detail about your appearance, he said. Don't you dare. Kavira's eyes showed patterns that definitely meant amusement. I'm deeply invested in seeing how embarrassingly poetic you can get. Consider it cultural research. They stood together in the threshold between professional and personal, between what they were and what they might become, while Luminara Prime glowed with the light of 1,000 biological